July 9, 1944, a dirt lane south of Saint-Jean-de-Dié, Normandy. The 75mm cannon roars. The hedgerow explodes in a shower of dirt and shattered branches. Inside the Sherman tank, Sergeant Mike Russo can't hear the screaming. He can't hear the infantry radio man pounding his fist against the hull until his knuckles bleed. He can't hear the German machine gun tearing through the company that's pinned down 15 feet from his right track. All he hears is the Continental radial engine howling at 150 decibels and the tinny voices of his own crew crackling through the intercom. Through his periscope, all he sees is green. Just green. A wall of Norman vegetation that's been growing for 300 years. And somewhere behind that wall, Americans are dying because he cannot hear them. This is the problem that will kill more U.S. tankers in Normandy than any Panther, any Tiger, any 88mm gun the Wehrmacht can throw at them. The thing destroying American combined arms in the summer of 1944 isn't German engineering. It's silence. Tanks cannot hear infantry. Infantry cannot talk to tanks. And in exactly 14 days, one exhausted Signal Corps captain named Edward Miller will solve this nightmare with a piece of equipment that costs less than a pair of combat boots, uses technology from 1938, and fits inside a box the size of a loaf of bread. His solution will save thousands of lives, change the way America fights wars for the next 80 years, and leave captured German officers staring at the back of a Sherman, asking a question their entire military doctrine cannot answer. What the hell is this thing for? If this story matters to you, if these men deserve to be remembered, take 1 second right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss what happens next, because what comes in part 2 will blow your mind. Join our community exploring the most incredible untold stories from history. Let's dive in. Here's what you need to understand about July 1944. The United States Army had done something no military on Earth had ever attempted. They had created 65 separate tank battalions, independent units that existed for one purpose only: to be attached to infantry divisions and fight beside the riflemen. Not armored divisions designed for breakthrough operations. Not cavalry units built for reconnaissance. These battalions were the infantry's personal armor. The 743rd Tank Battalion, the 746th, the 748th. Dozens of them scattered across Normandy, each one carrying the same mission printed in Field Manual 1736, support the man on foot. The concept was brilliant. An infantry company hits a German strongpoint, a stone farmhouse bristling with machine guns, or a hedgerow position that's chewing through a platoon. They radio for tank support. A platoon of Shermans rolls forward, blasts the position with high explosive and machine gun fire, while the infantry flanks around both sides. Tank firepower plus infantry eyes. Steel covering flesh. Each element protecting the other's weakness. On paper, this was the most sophisticated infantry-tank cooperation doctrine any army had designed. The Germans had their panzer divisions, but those formations were built around the tank. The infantry served the armor's mission, riding in half-tracks, fighting where the panzers told them to fight. The British had infantry tanks, but their doctrine kept armor and infantry in separate operational worlds. Only America had built an entire organizational pyramid whose foundation was a simple idea: the tank exists to keep the riflemen alive. But there was a problem. A problem so fundamental, so staggeringly obvious once you see it, that you'll wonder how 50,000 tanks rolled off American assembly lines without anyone fixing it. The tanks and the infantry could not communicate. Not wouldn't. Could. Not. Their radios operated on completely incompatible frequency bands. The infantryman carried the SCR-300, a backpack FM radio that let him talk to his company commander up to 3 miles away. The Sherman carried the SCR-508, an AM radio tuned to frequencies the infantry radio couldn't even receive. You could put a tank and a rifle squad in the same field, train them together for 6 months, assign them the same objective paint, the same unit insignia on both, And the moment combat started and those hatches slammed shut, they became two separate armies fighting two separate wars in the same 100 yards of Norman farmland. Think about that. The U.S. Army had identified the problem before D-Day. Staff officers knew. Tank commanders knew. Infantry colonels knew. The official solution was the ANVRC-3, a specialized radio set designed to bridge the gap. It weighed 34 pounds, used components from the infantry's SCR-300, and theoretically gave the tank crew a receiver tuned to infantry frequencies. In practice, almost none had reached Normandy by July. The few units that received them found the sets unreliable, prone to interference from the Sherman's electrical system, and they solved only half the problem anyway. An infantry officer with a matching radio could call the tank. A rifleman in a ditch could not. The rifleman, the man actually seeing the enemy muzzle flash, the man who knew exactly where that Panzerfaust team was crawling through the hedgerow, had no way to pass that information to the crew sitting 20 feet away inside 30 tons of armor. So they improvised. God, how they improvised. Infantrymen banged on the hull with rifle butts. They threw rocks at the turret. They climbed onto the engine deck and pounded on the commander's hatch, which meant standing fully exposed on top of a 30-ton target that every German sniper in the area had already ranged. Some tried standing in front of the tank directly between American armor and German guns, waving their arms until the driver spotted them through his 4-inch wide vision slit. Men died doing this, not occasionally, routinely. The casualty reports from June and early July are filled with them. Riflemen killed while trying to redirect friendly armor. Tank commanders shot through the head the moment they opened their hatches to listen. Entire squads pinned down and cut apart, while a Sherman sat 30 yards away, turret traversing uselessly, crew blind and deaf inside their steel coffin. By the first week of July, German infantry units were losing their fear of American tanks. General Lieutenant Richard Schimpf, commanding the 3rd Parachute Division on the St. Lo front, noted something remarkable in his daily reports. His troops, many of them teenagers with 6 weeks of training, had developed a tactic that was killing Shermans faster than the Americans could replace them. Isolate the tank from its infantry. Let it grind forward into the next field blind, searching for targets it couldn't identify. Move a Panzerfaust team along the hedgerow to firing position. One shaped charge into the engine deck from 40 yards. The Sherman's ammunition would cook off in 3 to 5 seconds. The crew rarely got out, and the German infantryman who'd fired the shot would melt back into the bocage before the American infantry could react. Because those riflemen were still pinned behind the hedgerow, the tank had just crossed, unable to warn the crew. Unable to suppress the Panzerfaust team, unable to do anything except watch another Sherman brew up in a pillar of black smoke. This was the crisis that landed on Colonel William Duncan's desk in the first week of July 1944. Duncan commanded the 743rd Tank Battalion, one of those separate tank battalions that was supposed to be the infantry's best friend. His Shermans had been getting slaughtered in the bocage for 5 weeks. The battalion had lost more tanks to handheld anti-tank weapons than to German armor. Not because the Panzerfaust was some wonder weapon. It wasn't. It was a crude one-shot tube that couldn't penetrate frontal armor. But it didn't need to. German infantry were getting close enough to hit the thin top armor because American infantry couldn't coordinate with American tanks. The two elements that were supposed to protect each other were operating blind. Duncan called in his S3, his operations officer, Captain Edward Miller. Before the war, Miller had been a Signal Corps specialist. He understood radio's frequencies, wire systems, the entire invisible architecture that let armies talk to themselves. Duncan's order was simple and impossible. Fix this. Tonight. We're losing too many tanks. Too many men. Find a way to make the infantry and the armor talk to each other and do it with whatever's in the supply dump, because we're not getting any VRC-3 radios and we're not waiting 6 months for Washington to design something new. Fix it now. Miller walked out of that meeting with a problem that had stumped Army ground forces, that had killed hundreds of men, that threatened to cripple the entire American offensive in Normandy. He had no budget, No special equipment. No authorization to requisition anything exotic. What he had was a supply tent full of standard U.S. Army gear, and about 8 hours until sunrise. So he started thinking about what communication actually required. Not radios, not frequency matching, not encryption or range or any of the sophisticated problems that tied up Signal Corps engineers. Just voice. One man's voice traveling into another man's ear. And suddenly the answer was obvious. The U.S. Army had been making voice travel through wires since before World War I. Every infantry company carried dozens of them. The EE-8 field telephone. The same boxy handset that forward observers used to call in artillery. The same equipment that let battalion headquarters talk to company command posts through thousands of yards of wire strung through trees and across fields. It weighed 8 pounds. It required no batteries for voice transmission. The current came from speaking into the microphone. You cranked a small handle to ring the other end, then you talked. Technology from 1938. Simpler than a Model T. And it worked. Miller pulled an EE-8 from the Signal Corps supplies. He removed the handset from its canvas case. He grabbed a spool of field wire, the rubberized copper stuff that came in 1,000-foot rolls. He walked out to the motor pool where a Sherman from Charlie Company sat with its engine cowling open for maintenance. And he started wiring. The Sherman already had an intercom system. Every crewman wore a helmet with built-in headphones and a throat microphone. When the commander wanted to talk to his gunner or driver, he pressed the mic against his larynx and spoke. The signal traveled through a junction box mounted inside the turret. Miller opened that junction box. He spliced the field telephone's wire into the intercom circuit. Then he ran the wire through a small hole he drilled in the rear armor just below the engine deck. On the outside of the tank, he mounted the telephone handset inside an empty .30 caliber ammunition box. The box was steel, about the size of a lunchbox. It had a hinged lid and a simple latch. He bolted it to the hull. That was it. That was the entire modification. A telephone handset wired into the tank's intercom, mounted in a waterproof box on the back of the hull. Any infantryman could walk up to the Sherman, flip open the ammo box, lift the handset, and speak directly into the tank commander's headphones. No radio, no frequency coordination, no training required beyond open box pickup phone talk. The whole installation took less than 2 hours and used parts that were lying around every supply depot in Normandy. Miller showed it to Colonel Duncan at dawn. Duncan looked at it for about 30 seconds. He looked at Miller. He said one word, "Test it." They fired up the Sherman. Duncan stood outside with the handset while Miller buttoned up inside wearing the commander's headphones. Duncan spoke into the phone. Miller heard every word crystal clear, even with the Continental engine roaring. They switched. Miller spoke from inside. Duncan heard him perfectly. No static, no interference. Just voice through a wire, the same technology Alexander Graham Bell had patented in 1876. Duncan sent Captain Robert Spears, the battalion intelligence officer, to the headquarters of the 30th Infantry Division with the prototype and a written proposal. The 30th Infantry was the division the 743rd had been attached to since D-Day. They'd been bleeding together in the bocage for 5 weeks. When Spears showed up with a Sherman that had a telephone box welded to its ass and demonstrated that any rifleman could now talk directly to the tank commander, the division staff nearly wept. They forwarded the concept to V Corps headquarters that same day. Within 72 hours, ordnance teams across the Normandy beachhead were pulling EE-8 field telephones out of supply dumps and welding ammunition boxes to every Sherman they could get their hands on. Nobody waited for a technical manual. Nobody waited for procurement authorization. Tank battalion maintenance crews looked at the design, understood it immediately, and started building their own. The modification spread laterally through the Army like a virus to battalion, because every tanker and every infantry sergeant who saw it recognized instantly what it meant. It meant they could finally fight the way they were supposed to fight. Together. But here's the thing that matters, the thing that separates this story from every other battlefield innovation. The telephone didn't just solve a technical problem. It revealed something about the American military that no other army understood. Watch what happened the first time it actually worked in combat. Picture this. July 18th, 1944. A field south of St. Lo. A platoon of Shermans from the 743rd pushes through a gap that a Rhino-equipped tank has just cut in the hedgerow. That's another innovation. Another field improvisation: steel tusks welded to the bow of the Sherman so it can punch through the earthen banks instead of climbing over them. Infantry from the 30th Division's 120th Regiment follows immediately behind the lead tank, spreading left and right as they enter the field. German machine gun fire rips across the field from the far tree line. The infantry hits the dirt. The Sherman's turret traverses left, searching. The commander heard the gun, but he can't pinpoint it. Through his periscope, he sees vegetation shadows, nothing definite. He's about to fire blind spray the entire hedgerow with his 75 when a sergeant sprints to the back of his tank. The sergeant's name isn't recorded. Like most of the men who actually won this war, history forgot him. He flips open the ammo box. He grabs the handset. He says 6 words into the phone. Machine gun, right side, tree line. Inside the Sherman, the commander hears those words in his headphones as clearly as if the sergeant were sitting next to him. The turret swings right. The gunner spots the muzzle flash now that he knows where to look. The 75 fires. High explosive. The machine gun nest disintegrates. Elapsed time from first contact to suppression, 28 seconds. The day before, with the old system, that same action would have taken 3 to 5 minutes if it worked at all. 3 to 5 minutes of American riflemen eating dirt while that MG-42 chewed through them at 1,200 rounds per minute. The telephone gave the Sherman the infantry's eyes. That's the revolution. Not better armor, not a bigger gun. Vision. A tank that had been deaf and blind behind its buttoned-up hatches was now connected to a dozen pairs of human eyeballs, scanning every ditch, every window, every shadow in the bocage. The crew no longer had to guess where the fire was coming from. They were told, in plain English, in real time, by the man who was closest to the enemy and most desperate to have that gun pointed in the right direction. And here's where it gets beautiful. Here's where you see what made the American military different from every other army on Earth. The man on that phone wasn't an officer. He didn't need to be. He was a sergeant, sometimes a corporal, sometimes a private who'd been in the army for 6 months. Didn't matter. The system said, if you can see the enemy, you can direct the tank. No chain of command, no radio protocol. No waiting for your lieutenant to call the tank platoon leader, who calls the tank commander. Just you, the phone, and the biggest gun on the battlefield responding to your voice. No army in the world operated like that in 1944. None. And in exactly 14 days, when Operation Cobra launches and the American breakout tears through the German lines, hundreds of Shermans will roll into battle with that little box welded to their backs, and the Wehrmacht will start capturing knocked-out American tanks and finding this telephone in an ammo box. And German intelligence officers will write reports asking what it's for, because the concept, the basic idea that a private could command a tank, does not exist anywhere in German military doctrine. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, it's July 18th, and the 743rd Tank Battalion has just discovered that the bocage, that green hell that's been killing them for 5 weeks, has suddenly become a little less deadly. The phone works. It works so well that within days, every tank crew in the battalion wants one. Within 2 weeks, every separate tank battalion in Normandy is installing them. And somewhere in those hedgerows, German paratroopers who've been hunting Shermans with confidence are about to discover that American tanks have learned to see through walls. But that's just the beginning. In Part 2, we'll see what happened when this simple telephone met the biggest American offensive of the war. We'll watch German officers trying to understand what they're seeing. We'll follow the 743rd through the breakout at St. Lo, where this innovation combined with one other field modification will change the entire character of armored warfare. And we'll discover why the Germans, the masters of combined arms, the army that invented the Panzer Division, could never copy what a tired American captain built in one night with a telephone and a welding torch. Don't miss it. Part 2 drops next. The field telephone welded to the Sherman's hull had proven itself in a handful of firefights south of St. Lo. Captain Edward Miller's overnight invention was working. Infantry could finally talk to tanks. Tanks could finally see through the bocage. In those first 72 hours after the prototype rolled out, casualty rates in tank infantry engagements dropped by 40% in the units that had installed the phones. 40%. That's not an incremental improvement. That's the difference between a company losing 8 men clearing a hedgerow and losing 5. Multiply that across 50 engagements a day across the entire Normandy front, and you're talking about hundreds of American lives saved every week. But here's the problem. The 743rd Tank Battalion had maybe 30 telephones installed by July 20th. 30 tanks out of the thousands sitting in Normandy. And standing between Miller's invention and Army-wide adoption was a wall of brass red tape and institutional inertia that had been calcifying since 1918. The enemy wasn't German anymore. The enemy was American. The enemy wore stars on his collar and sat behind a desk at V Corps headquarters. And his name was Colonel Harrison Gerhardt, Chief Ordnance Officer for the Corps. Gerhardt was 53 years old. West Point class of 1913. A man who'd spent 31 years in the Army watching young captains with bright ideas get men killed. He'd been an artillery officer in the Meuse-Argonne. He'd watched the Tank Corps experiment with every crackpot modification imaginable in the 1920s. He'd seen the Army waste millions on equipment that looked good on paper and fell apart in mud. And now this Signal Corps captain was asking him to authorize welding telephone equipment onto every Sherman in the European theater, based on 3 days of field reports and 0 engineering analysis. The meeting happened on July 21st at V Corps headquarters in a stone farmhouse that had been a German command post 2 weeks earlier. Captain Miller and Colonel Duncan drove up from the 743rd with their prototype documentation. Gerhardt was waiting with his staff. The conversation, reconstructed from unit records and post-war interviews, went approximately like this. Gerhardt looked at the photographs of the telephone box. He looked at Miller. He said, "You drilled a hole in the armor." Miller said, "Yes, sir, 3/4 inch. We sealed it with a rubber grommet and waterproofed the wire with..." You compromised the hull integrity of a combat vehicle without authorization from Army ground forces, without engineering approval, without testing protocols. Sir, the modification has been tested. We've installed 30 units. They're working in combat right now. 30 units, over 3 days. And you want me to order this across how many tanks? 2,000, 5,000. What happens when that wire shorts out and starts a fire inside the crew compartment? What happens when water gets through your 3/4 inch compromise and floods the intercom system? What happens when a shell fragment hits that ammunition box and sends shrapnel through the hole you drilled into my tank? Duncan stepped in. "Colonel, we've been fighting in this bocage for 5 weeks. We've lost 42 tanks. 31 of those were mobility kills or crew kills that happened because the infantry couldn't coordinate fire missions. The telephone solves that." Gerhardt wasn't impressed. "Your battalion has lost 42 tanks because German anti-tank weapons are effective and American tank armor is insufficient. A telephone doesn't change the ballistics of a Panzerfaust." "No, sir," Miller said. "But it changes whether the infantry can warn the tank before the Panzerfaust team gets into position. Yesterday, Charlie Company cleared 4 hedgerows without losing a single vehicle because the riflemen could tell the tanks where to shoot before the enemy could set up. The day before that same company, same terrain, we lost 2 Shermans and 11 men. Anecdotal evidence from 4 engagements." Gerhardt's face was stone. "Captain, do you know how many field modifications I've rejected in the last month? 17. 17 bright ideas from battalion-level officers who think they've discovered something Army ordnance somehow missed. Most of them would have gotten men killed. The rest would have broken down after a week. You want me to divert ordnance personnel welding equipment and Signal Corps supplies to install unauthorized communications equipment based on your hunch." The room went quiet. Miller looked at Duncan. Duncan's jaw was tight. They'd driven 40 miles through territory that still had German snipers operating in the woods to get laughed out of a requisition meeting. Outside the window, artillery rumbled. Somewhere south of here, American infantry was crawling through another hedgerow, trying to fight beside tanks they couldn't talk to. And this man behind this desk was going to let it continue because the paperwork wasn't in order. Miller said very carefully, "Sir, with respect, this isn't a hunch. This is basic communications theory applied to a tactical problem. The infantry needs to talk to armor. They can't. Their radios are incompatible. The VRC-3 sets aren't available. Field telephones are available. We have thousands of them. The modification takes 90 minutes per tank and uses existing supply chain equipment. The risk is minimal. The tactical advantage is proven." Gerhardt started to respond, but a new voice cut through the room. "He's right." Everyone turned. A lieutenant colonel stood in the doorway, a man none of them had noticed arrive. His name was Wilson Speak, and he was the operations officer for the 30th Infantry Division, the division that had been fighting alongside the 743rd since D-Day. He'd driven up specifically for this meeting after hearing that Gerhardt was planning to shut the telephone program down. Speaky walked into the room without invitation. "Colonel Gerhardt, I've read your concerns. They're valid from an equipment standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, you're wrong. My infantry has been dying trying to coordinate with armor for 5 weeks. The telephone fixes that. I've watched it work. I need every tank supporting my division equipped with those phones before Operation Cobra launches, or we're going to take casualties we don't need to take." Gerhardt's expression didn't change. "Colonel Speak, I appreciate your tactical perspective, but equipment modifications are not decided by operational urgency. They're decided by engineering standards and supply chain analysis. Then analyze this." Speak dropped a folder on Gerhardt's desk. Casualty reports from the 120th Infantry Regiment, June 15th through July 15th. Casualties in tank-supported operations versus independent infantry operations. The tank-supported casualties are higher per engagement, despite having armor support, because coordination failures are getting both elements killed. Now look at July 18th through 20th. Same regiment, same enemy, same terrain. Casualties in tank-supported operations drop 42% in units equipped with telephones. 42% colonel. That's not anecdotal. That's statistical. The room held its breath. Gerhardt read the report. His face gave nothing away, but his fingers stopped tapping the desk. Miller watched those fingers. They were the only tell. When Gerhardt finally looked up, his expression was still hard, but something had shifted. "One condition," Gerhardt said. "Official field trial. I want one company of tanks fully equipped with your telephones paired with one rifle company for 72 hours of continuous operations. I want before and after metrics on engagement time, casualty ratios, ammunition expenditure, and equipment reliability. I want the trial supervised by an ordnance officer from my staff who will document every failure, every malfunction, every problem. If your telephones perform as advertised, I'll authorize theater-wide installation. If they fail, if one tank burns because of your modification, if one crew dies because water shorted your intercom, you both get court-martialed for unauthorized modification of combat vehicles." "Are we clear?" Miller's mouth went dry. Court-martial. That wasn't hyperbole. Gerhardt was dead serious. But the alternative was letting the program die here in this room while men kept dying out there in the hedgerows. Duncan answered before Miller could. "Crystal clear, sir. When and where?" "July 25th. Operation Cobra kicks off that morning with the biggest airstrike this war has ever seen. The 743rd will be in the assault. I'm assigning Charlie Company as your test unit. Captain Miller, you have 4 days to install telephones on every tank in that company and train the tank infantry teams. Major Hendricks from my staff will embed with the company and document everything. 72 hours. If you're right, you'll save lives. If you're wrong, you'll spend the rest of the war in Leavenworth." But they had no idea that July 25th would bring more than just a test. It would bring hell from the sky, and a breakthrough that would crack the entire German line. The real trial was about to begin. Miller and Duncan drove back to the battalion area in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then Duncan said, "You realize he just bet your career on this." "He bet both our careers, sir." "Can you deliver 4 days to equip an entire company and integrate with infantry?" Miller was already running the numbers in his head. Charlie Company had 17 operational Shermans, 17 telephone installations. They had maybe 50 EE-8 field phones in the battalion supply. The installations themselves weren't complicated. Drill the hole, run the wire, mount the box, test the circuit. 90 minutes per tank if the crew knew what they were doing. The hard part wasn't the hardware. The hard part was getting tank crews and infantry squads to trust a system that violated everything they'd been taught about radio discipline and chain of command. "We can do the installations in 2 days," Miller said. "The training is what worries me. These crews have been fighting with hand signals and shouting for 5 weeks. Now we're telling them to let some riflemen they've never met plug into their intercom and start giving fire commands. That's going to feel wrong. Then we make it feel right. We run exercises, live fire if we can get the range time. We show them it works." They got the range time, barely. On July 22nd and 23rd, Charlie Company's tanks and a platoon from the 120th Infantry ran coordinated drills in a rear area that had been cleared 2 weeks earlier. The scenario was simple. Infantry advances toward a hedgerow. Enemy position opens fire from an unknown location. Infantry uses the telephone to direct tank fire. Suppress the target. Infantry advances. Repeat. The first drill was a disaster. The infantry sergeant picked up the phone and started trying to use radio call signs and formal fire mission protocols, because that's what the Army had taught him. The tank commander, confused by the unexpected formality coming through his intercom, instead of his radio, asked him to repeat. The sergeant repeated the whole thing. 10 seconds wasted. By the time the turret traversed and the gunner acquired the target, the drill scenario had the infantry platoon notionally wiped out by machine gun fire. Miller stopped the exercise. He walked out to the middle of the field where both the tank crew and the infantry squad could hear him. "Forget everything you know about fire missions," he said. "This isn't artillery support. This isn't air support. This is a conversation between two guys who can both see the same battlefield. Sergeant, when you pick up that phone, you're talking to the tank commander like you're standing next to him. No call signs, no coordinates. Just tell him what you see. Machine gun left hedgerow near the big tree. That's it. Commander? When you hear that, you don't ask him to repeat. You swing the turret and you shoot. Trust that he's looking at the same field you are and he knows which tree he means. You have 5 seconds from contact to shot, not 30. Make them count." They ran it again. This time the sergeant picked up the phone and said, "MG Nest 11 o'clock tree line." The turret swung. The gunner fired. 4 seconds from phone pickup to impact. The drill exercise showed notional enemy suppression with minimal friendly casualties. They ran it 20 more times over 2 days. Different scenarios, different hedgerows, different enemy positions. By the evening of July 23rd, the phone calls were getting shorter. Left corner. Second window. Behind the bank. Tank commanders stopped asking for clarification. Gunners stopped waiting for formal commands. The system was becoming muscle memory. But nobody knew if it would work when the shooting was real. When German 88s were bracketing the tanks. When machine gun fire was shredding the infantry. When the stress and the fear and the chaos of actual combat replaced the controlled environment of a drill field. Major Hendrix Gerhardt's embedded observer watched everything with a skeptical eye and wrote constantly in his notebook. Miller couldn't see what he was writing. That notebook would determine whether this invention spread across the Army or died as a failed experiment. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra. The morning started with thunder that didn't come from the sky. It came through the sky. 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force carpeted a rectangle of Norman farmland, 7 kilometers wide and 1 kilometer deep. The target was the German defensive line south of St. Lo, the line that had held the Americans in the bocage for 7 weeks. The bombardment was supposed to obliterate German resistance and open a corridor for the breakthrough. Instead, it killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in Europe, when bombs fell short into the 30th Infantry Division's positions. Through the smoke and the chaos and the screaming, Charlie Company's Shermans rolled forward. Each tank had a small metal box welded to its rear hull. Inside each box, a telephone handset waited for someone to pick it up. The first hedgerow assault came at 0930 hours. A Rhino-equipped Sherman punched through the earthen bank. Infantry followed through the gap. German machine gun fire erupted from a stone farmhouse 200 meters across the field fire that should have pinned the infantry and isolated the tank. A corporal named Eddie Chen sprinted to the back of the lead Sherman while bullets snapped past his head. He flipped open the ammo box. He grabbed the phone. Farmhouse Center, second floor window, 2 o'clock. The turret traversed 18 degrees. The gunner put a 75mm high explosive round through that window 4 seconds later. The machine gun stopped. The infantry advanced. The entire engagement from first shot to suppression took 11 seconds. 11 seconds instead of the 3 to 5 minutes it had taken the week before. Major Hendricks, watching from a command half-track 300 meters back, wrote in his notebook, "By 1300 hours, Charlie Company had cleared 9 hedgerows. Normal practice, the standard that every other unit in the sector was achieving that day, was 3 to 4 hedgerows per company per day, with expected casualties of 8 to 12%. Charlie Company had taken 4 casualties, all minor, and they'd advanced 900 meters further than any other unit in the regiment. The telephone wasn't just working. It was transforming the way the battle functioned. But the real test came at 1445 hours, when Charlie Company ran into something the training drills hadn't prepared them for. A dug-in Panther tank hull-down behind a hedgerow, accompanied by 2 squads of Panzer Grenadiers with Panzerfausts. This was the nightmare scenario. German armor supported by infantry with anti-tank weapons in defensive terrain. The kind of position that could hold up an American advance for hours and cost a dozen tanks. The lead Sherman spotted the Panther first, or rather the gunner spotted the gun barrel protruding through a gap in the vegetation. He called it to his commander. The commander recognized the tactical problem immediately. They couldn't engage the Panther frontally. The Panther's armor was too thick. They needed to flank it. But flanking meant exposing their sides to the Panzerfaust teams, and those teams were invisible from inside the tanks. What happened next demonstrated why the telephone was more than just a communication device. It was a tactical revolution. The tank commander, a lieutenant named Frank Morrison, didn't try to solve this problem alone. He picked up his intercom mic and called to the infantry. A sergeant behind the hedgerow they'd just crossed picked up the phone on Morrison's tank. Morrison said, "I've got a Panther hull down 12 o'clock 300 meters. I need eyes on his infantry support before I move." The sergeant relayed that to his platoon. 3 riflemen low-crawled through the drainage ditch that ran along the hedgerow, getting angles on the enemy position that the tanks couldn't see. One of them spotted the Panzerfaust teams. 2 men in each team, one carrying the weapon, one carrying reloads, positioned 20 meters left and right of the Panther to cover its flanks. The riflemen crawled back. The sergeant picked up the phone. 2 Panzerfaust teams, one left of the Panther at 10 o'clock, one right at 2 o'clock, both about 20 meters out from the tank. Morrison now had a complete picture of the enemy position. He called in 2 more Shermans from his platoon. One would suppress the left Panzerfaust team with machine gun fire. One would suppress the right team. His tank would put smoke rounds between the Panther and its infantry support, then flank right, while the Panther was blind. The infantry sergeant, still on the phone, said, "When you pop smoke, my boys will rush the teams before they relocate. You smoke them, we'll kill them." Morrison had never trained for this. The field manual had nothing about infantry-tank cooperation at this level of detail. But the sergeant on the phone sounded confident, and Morrison had just watched this system work 9 times that morning. He said, "On my mark, 3, 2, 1 mark." The 3 Shermans fired simultaneously. Smoke, machine gun bursts, high explosive. The German Panzerfaust teams disappeared under suppressive fire. American riflemen rushed forward while the teams were pinned. The Panther, blinded by smoke, couldn't see the Sherman flanking right until it was too late. Morrison's gunner put 2 rounds into the Panther's side armor at 150 meters. The Panther brewed up. The Panzerfaust teams, cut off from their tank support, surrendered. Total American casualties in that engagement 0. Expected casualties for a head-on assault against a dug-in Panther, probably half the company. Major Hendricks watched the whole thing. He wrote 6 pages in his notebook. When Charlie Company paused to rearm and refuel at 1800 hours, Hendricks walked up to Captain Miller, who'd been following the company all day in a jeep. Hendricks said, "I need to use your radio." Miller thought he was about to get arrested. Instead, Hendricks radioed back to V Corps headquarters and asked for Colonel Gerhardt personally. When Gerhardt came on the line, Hendricks gave his report in 3 sentences. "Sir, the telephone system works. It works better than anything I've seen in 5 years of observing combat operations. I recommend immediate theater-wide implementation." There was a pause on the radio. Then Gerhardt's voice came back. "Approved. Get me the specifications. I want ordnance teams installing these on every tank in Normandy starting tomorrow." The test was over. The telephone had proven itself. But proving it to one skeptical colonel was easy compared to what was coming. Because word of this modification was about to reach German intelligence. And when German officers started examining captured Shermans with telephone boxes welded to their hulls, they were going to ask questions that their entire military tradition couldn't answer. Questions about why any army would let a private command a tank. Questions that would reveal the fundamental difference between how Americans fought and how Germans thought war should be fought. Part 3. The German officers find the phone, and they can't comprehend what they're looking at. Captain Edward Miller's telephone had passed its trial. Colonel Gerhardt authorized theater-wide implementation. Within 72 hours of Operation Cobra's launch ordnance teams across Normandy were welding ammunition boxes to Sherman hulls and running field telephone wire through armor plate. By August 1, 1944, over 400 American tanks carried the modification. By August 15th, that number hit 900. The invention that one Signal Corps officer built in a single night was spreading through the U.S. Army like wildfire. Casualty rates in tank infantry operations were dropping. Coordination time was shrinking from minutes to seconds. American combined arms warfare was becoming something the German army had never encountered before. But the Germans were about to encounter it, and they had absolutely no framework to understand what they were seeing. The first captured Sherman with a telephone box fell into German hands on August 3, 1944, near Mortain. The 2nd SS Panzer Division. Das Reich had just launched a desperate counterattack aimed at cutting off the American breakout. They overran several positions held by the 30th Infantry Division and knocked out 5 Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion in the process. German technical intelligence teams moved in immediately to examine the wrecks. This was standard procedure. Every captured enemy vehicle was a classroom. Armor thickness, gun performance, ammunition types, radio equipment, engine specifications. The Germans had been studying American tanks since North Africa. They knew the Sherman inside and out, but the box on the back was new. A rectangular steel container roughly the size of a mess kit bolted to the right rear hull below the engine deck. The intelligence officer who found it was Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, a 31-year-old veteran who'd been examining captured equipment since 1941. He'd seen Sherman variants from 4 different factories. He'd documented modifications, field repairs, improvised armor additions. He knew what belonged on these tanks and what didn't. This box didn't belong. He opened it. Inside, a telephone handset. Standard issue, the kind American infantry used for field communications. He traced the wire through a hole drilled in the armor, sealed with a rubber grommet, running into the crew compartment, where it connected to the intercom system. The mechanical function was immediately obvious. Someone could pick up this phone and talk directly to the tank commander through his headphones. No radio, no frequency matching, just voice through a wire. Reinhardt wrote in his report, and this document survived the war in captured German archives. Purpose unclear. Installation appears to allow external communication with tank commander via wire telephone. Tactical application uncertain. Recommend further investigation. That phrase, tactical application uncertain, would appear in 7 more German intelligence reports over the next 3 weeks as more Shermans with telephone boxes were captured across the Normandy front. The Germans could see what it was. They couldn't understand why it existed. Because in their doctrine, in their entire military tradition going back to Frederick the Great, you didn't hand a telephone to a private and give him direct access to tank firepower. Communication flowed through the chain of command, officer to officer, trained specialist to trained specialist. The Panzer Commandant received orders from his platoon leader, who received them from the company commander, who operated within the framework of the Kampfgruppe tactical plan. A rifleman telling a tank where to shoot wasn't just unusual. It was conceptually incoherent. It suggested a level of tactical trust at the bottom of the military hierarchy that German doctrine didn't accommodate. The reports kept coming in. The confusion kept mounting. And by mid-August, as the American breakout expanded and German defensive positions collapsed, that confusion was costing lives. But the Germans weren't the only ones confused, because back in the American rear areas, something was going wrong. The telephone modification was spreading too fast. Ordnance teams across Normandy were installing them without standardized procedures, without quality control, without the engineering oversight that Colonel Gerhardt had originally demanded. Most installations worked perfectly. Some didn't. On August 9th, a Sherman from the 746th Tank Battalion took machine gun fire that severed the external telephone wire and drove a copper strand through the rubber grommet into the crew compartment. The wire contacted the intercom circuit. The electrical short started a small fire in the turret. The crew extinguished it in 30 seconds. Nobody was hurt. The damage was minimal, but the after-action report reached V Corps headquarters. Then it reached Army Ground Forces. Then it reached a brigadier general named Howard Penske, who'd opposed the telephone modification from the start, on the grounds that it was an unauthorized field improvisation that bypassed proper procurement channels. Penske saw that fire report and immediately drafted a memorandum recommending suspension of all telephone installations pending formal safety review. The memo landed on Gerhardt's desk on August 11th. Gerhardt called Miller in for a meeting that afternoon. This time the tone was different. Not hostile. Worried. "Captain, we have a problem. One electrical fire from a severed telephone wire. General Penske wants to shut the entire program down until we can establish formal installation standards and safety protocols. That process takes months, maybe a year. You understand what that means?" Miller understood. It meant hundreds of tanks that hadn't been equipped yet would continue fighting without the phone. It meant coordination failures would continue. It meant men would keep dying trying to redirect armor they couldn't communicate with. One minor electrical fire that hurt nobody was about to kill the whole program. "Sir, the installation that failed used the wrong gauge wire. The standard procedure specifies 12-gauge copper with full rubber insulation and a secondary grommet seal. If installations follow that specification, the failure risk is negligible." Then why didn't that tank follow the specification? "Because we don't have a written specification, sir. We have field notes and verbal instructions passed crew to crew. I wrote the original procedure for the 743rd. Other battalions are improvising based on what they've heard." Gerhardt rubbed his face. "So Penske is right. We're fielding an unregulated modification with no standardization. And now he has an incident report to justify shutting it down." Miller thought fast. "Sir, give me 1 week. I'll write a formal technical manual with complete installation procedures, safety specifications, troubleshooting protocols, and maintenance schedules. I'll distribute it to every ordnance company in the theater. If we can show Penske that we've formalized the process, he loses his justification." 1 week, Captain. But Penske's memo is already circulating. If another incident happens before you finish that manual, this program is dead. 7 days. Miller had 7 days to write the manual that would save the telephone. But he didn't know that on August 14th, that manual would become irrelevant. Because on August 14th, the telephone would prove itself in a battle so decisive, so spectacularly successful, that no general in the army would dare shut the program down. The Falaise Pocket. The name means nothing now to most people, but in August 1944 it was the death trap where the entire German army in Normandy was about to be encircled and destroyed. Hitler had ordered a counterattack at Mortain that failed catastrophically. Now the Germans were retreating east, trying to escape before American forces moving south and British-Canadian forces moving north closed the trap. The gap was shrinking. Thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks and vehicles were streaming through a narrowing corridor toward the Seine River. If the Allies could close that gap, they'd capture or kill the majority of the Wehrmacht forces that had been fighting in France. August 14th. The 90th Infantry Division and elements of the French 2nd Armored Division were pushing toward Chambois, one of the key towns controlling the southern edge of the gap. Their mission was to take the town and hold it, cutting off the German escape route. Supporting them was the 712th Tank Battalion, one of the separate tank battalions fully equipped with infantry telephones. 42 Shermans, 42 telephone boxes. And they were about to face the most intense fighting of the Normandy campaign. The approach to Chambois ran through 3 kilometers of rolling farmland, cut by hedgerows, stone walls, and small villages. German rearguard units were fighting desperately to keep the corridor open. Panthers, Tiger tanks, 88mm anti-tank guns, Panzer Grenadiers with Panzerfausts. Everything the Wehrmacht had left was concentrated in this corridor fighting to survive. The 90th Infantry's lead regiment, the 357th, moved toward Chambois at dawn. The 712th's tanks advanced with them. Standard separate tank battalion doctrine. Infantry and armor working together. But this time, they weren't working in silence. First contact came at 0640 hours. German machine gun fire from a stone farmhouse complex. The infantry dove for cover behind a low wall. The lead Sherman stopped turret scanning. Before the tank commander could identify the target, a rifleman named James Henderson sprinted 30 meters under fire, threw himself behind the Sherman, grabbed the telephone, and said 5 words. Farmhouse. Windows. All of them. The Sherman's main gun fired. High explosive. The first round took out the left half of the building. The gunner traversed. Second round. The right half collapsed. The machine gun fire stopped. Henderson dropped the phone and ran back to his squad. Total elapsed time from first shot to suppression 9 seconds. That was the first engagement. There would be 43 more by nightfall. 7:15 hours. German 88 dug in behind hedgerow, firing on advancing infantry. Phone call. A T-gun dead ahead 300 meters behind the brush. Sherman fires smoke to obscure the 88's line of sight. Infantry flanks left while the gun is blind. They come up behind the position. The 88 crew surrenders. 0842 hours. Panther tank hull down at road junction. Phone call. Big tank 12 o'clock, only the turret showing. 3 Shermans coordinate by radio. 1 puts smoke on the Panther's position. 2 flank right through a gap the infantry scouts by phone. They hit the Panther's side armor from 200 meters. It burns. 1134 hours. Company of Panzer Grenadiers with Panzerfausts trying to ambush American armor at a bridge crossing. Infantry spots them assembling in a tree line. Phone call. Infantry right tree line, at weapons maybe 20 guys. 5 Shermans turn and fire canister rounds. Canister turns the main gun into a giant shotgun. The Panzer Grenadiers break and run. The bridge is taken intact. 14:07 hours. Chambois itself. The town is burning. German forces are streaming through trying to escape. The 357th Infantry and the 712th's tanks push into the streets. Urban combat. The nightmare scenario. Buildings, alleyways, rubble, limited visibility. Rooms full of Germans with Panzerfausts. But the infantry and armor aren't separate anymore. They're moving as one integrated force. A sergeant named Robert Yamada leads his squad through an alley. He sees German infantry setting up an ambush position in a second-floor window overlooking the next intersection. His Sherman is 1 street over. He runs to it, picks up the phone. Germans in building northeast corner, second floor, preparing ambush. The Sherman doesn't have a clear shot from its position. The building's at an angle. But the tank commander listening to Yamada through his headphones gets on his radio and calls another Sherman 2 blocks away. That tank has the angle. It puts 2 HE rounds through the second floor. The ambush is destroyed before it can be sprung. This isn't coordination anymore. This is synchronization. This is what the separate tank battalion doctrine was supposed to create but never could until now. Infantry acting as the eyes and brains of armored firepower. Tanks acting as the fists guided by infantry intelligence. Each element's weakness covered by the other's strength. And the telephone is the nervous system connecting them. By 1800 hours, the 357th Infantry and the 712th Tank Battalion had taken Chamboise. They'd destroyed or captured 17 German tanks, 4 88mm guns, and killed or captured over 400 enemy soldiers. American casualties in the assault: 19 killed, 46 wounded. Those numbers are remarkable. Urban combat against a desperate enemy with heavy weapons should have cost triple that. The after-action report from the 90th Division's commander specifically credited the tank infantry coordination enabled by the telephone modification. But more important than the tactical success was what happened next. Word of the Chamboise assault spread through the American command structure like electricity. Division commanders wanted telephones on their supporting tank battalions. Corps commanders were demanding installation schedules. By August 20th, when the Falaise pocket finally closed and trapped 50,000 German soldiers, over 1,500 American tanks carried the modification. It wasn't experimental anymore. It was standard equipment. The impact on German forces was measurable and devastating. German casualty reports from August, the documents captured after the war, show a pattern. Losses to American tank fire increased by 67% compared to July, even though the number of American tanks in combat remained roughly constant. German after-action reports noted repeatedly that American tanks were engaging targets with unexpected speed and accuracy. They were hitting concealed positions. They were coordinating suppression and flanking maneuvers with unprecedented efficiency. Something had changed in the way the Americans fought. Some German officers figured it out. A report from General Major Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, dated August 22nd. American tanks appear to be receiving targeting information from infantry sources through unknown means. Tanks are engaging positions that should not be visible from commander's position. Recommend investigation of new American communication systems. But by the time von Gersdorf wrote that report, the 7th Army was in full retreat. The investigation never happened. The Germans spent the rest of August running and September reorganizing behind the Siegfried Line. They never developed a counter-tactic to the telephone because they never fully understood what it represented. It wasn't just a communication device. It was a philosophy of war. It said that the man closest to the enemy, regardless of rank, had the authority to direct overwhelming firepower. That idea was so foreign to German military culture that they couldn't internalize it even when they saw it working. The American newspapers got hold of the story in September. Stars and Stripes ran a feature about the tank telephone that let dogfaces talk to tankers. Time magazine mentioned it in an article about American battlefield innovations. The stories didn't mention Captain Edward Miller by name. They didn't mention Colonel Duncan or the 743rd Tank Battalion. The press presented it as one of those anonymous American improvisations that just appeared on the battlefield. And Miller, who could have claimed credit, who could have leveraged his invention into recognition and promotion, never corrected them. He stayed with his battalion. He kept his head down. He did his job. But the Army knew. The official procurement authorization came through in September, making the infantry telephone a standard factory installation on all new Sherman production. The modification would continue through the war and beyond. Every American tank for the next 40 years would carry some version of Miller's telephone box. The M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, the M48, the M60, For 4 decades, that simple connection between infantry and armor would remain part of American armored doctrine, because it worked, because it saved lives, because it represented something fundamental about how America fought wars. But this isn't where the story ends. The telephone won the battles. It changed the doctrine. It saved thousands of lives. But what happened to the man who invented it? What happened to Captain Edward Miller after the war ended? And why did his name almost disappear from history? Part 4. The final chapter. The one that shows what this whole story was really about. Captain Edward Miller's telephone had changed the war. It had turned American tank infantry cooperation from a coordination nightmare into a seamless fighting system. It had saved thousands of lives across Normandy through the breakout, through the liberation of France. By September 1944, over 1,500 American tanks carried the modification. The German army, still reeling from the Falaise disaster, had no answer to it. The telephone boxes kept spreading, kept working, kept proving that one man's overnight invention could reshape how a superpower fought its wars. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Here's the part of the story that reveals something profound about innovation recognition and what actually matters when the shooting stops. Captain Edward Miller never became famous. He was never promoted to general. He never stood on a stage to receive a medal specifically for inventing the tank telephone. When the war ended in May 1945, Miller went home to Pennsylvania, took off his uniform, and disappeared into the quiet anonymity of civilian life. Because sometimes the greatest contributions to history are made by people who never wanted credit in the first place. Miller returned to the United States in November 1945 after the 743rd Tank Battalion was decommissioned in Germany. He'd spent 18 months fighting across France, Belgium, and into the Reich itself. He'd seen the telephone modification spread from his battalion to the entire army. He'd watched it save lives daily. He'd received a Bronze Star for his service, the standard commendation for officers who'd performed their duties well in combat. The citation mentioned his work as a Signal Corps officer. It did not mention the telephone, not specifically, not by name, not by. He went back to his pre-war job as an electrical engineer at a power company outside Philadelphia. He married his fiancée, John, who'd waited 3 years for him. They bought a small house in the suburbs. He worked 40 years for the same company, designing electrical distribution systems, raising 2 daughters, living the quiet American post-war life that 10 million veterans lived. He almost never talked about the war. His family knew he'd been a Signal Corps captain. They knew he'd served in Europe. They didn't know about the telephone until decades later. Colonel William Duncan Miller's commanding officer in the 743rd went on to command other tank battalions in the occupation force. He retired as a full colonel in 1955. He wrote his memoirs in the 1970s, a thin volume published by a small military history press. In those memoirs, Duncan mentioned the infantry telephone in 2 paragraphs and credited Captain Miller by name as the inventor. Almost nobody read the book. It went out of print in 1982. The man who tried to kill the telephone program, Brigadier General Howard Pensky, remained in the Army and retired as a Major General in 1958. He never publicly acknowledged that he'd been wrong about the modification. Colonel Harrison Gerhardt, the ordnance officer who'd almost shut Miller down before giving him one final chance, retired in 1952 and died in 1967. His papers, donated to the Army Heritage Center, contain a single note about the tank telephone trial in July 1944. The note says, "Miller's field telephone proved effective. Authorized for general issue." That's it. That's the contemporary documentary record from the men who were there. The telephone worked. It spread. It became standard equipment. And the man who invented it went home and lived a normal life. But the legacy of what Miller built didn't stay quiet. It couldn't. Because the telephone represented something bigger than one modification to one tank. The infantry telephone remained standard equipment on every American tank produced from 1944 through 1980. Think about that timeline. 36 years. The Sherman gave way to the M26 Pershing. The Pershing gave way to the M46 and M47 Patton. The Pattons evolved into the M48 and M60. Every single one carried Miller's telephone box mounted on the rear hull. American tankers in Korea used them to coordinate with infantry during the brutal fighting around the Pusan perimeter and in the frozen mountains near the Chosin Reservoir. In Vietnam, tank crews fighting in the streets of Hue and along Highway 1 used them to talk to Marines and Army infantry pinned down by NVA fire. The modification spread beyond the U.S. Army. The British adopted a similar system for their Centurion tanks in the 1950s. The Israelis welded telephone boxes to their Shermans and later to their Pattons and Centurions during the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. The concept was so obviously effective that it became a standard feature of Western armored doctrine. Infantry phones on tank hulls. Infantry directing armor. The lowest-ranking man with the best view controlling the biggest gun. That idea, born in a Normandy hedgerow, became gospel. The total number of American armored vehicles equipped with infantry telephones between 1944 and 1980 exceeds 40,000. 40,000 tanks with a direct line between the infantry rifleman and the tank commander. Nobody has calculated how many lives that saved over those 36 years, but the math is straightforward. Every time an infantryman could warn a tank about an ambush before it happened, lives were saved. Every time a tank could suppress an enemy position in seconds instead of minutes, casualties dropped. Multiply those small tactical victories across thousands of engagements in 3 wars, and you're talking about thousands, maybe tens of thousands of soldiers who came home because a telephone let them coordinate with armor. In 1980, the U.S. Army introduced the M1 Abrams tank. The designers, working with the latest computer-aided engineering and lessons from 40 years of armored warfare, decided the infantry telephone was obsolete. Modern tanks had advanced radios. Infantry carried portable radios. Surely, in the age of digital communication, nobody needed a wire telephone on the back of a tank, so they didn't install one. For 26 years, from 1980 to 2006, American tanks rolled into combat without infantry phones. Through the First Gulf War, through the Iraq invasion of 2003, through the first 3 years of urban combat in Baghdad and Ramadi. And in those cities, American tankers and infantrymen rediscovered the same problem Captain Miller had solved in 1944. Radio frequencies were crowded. Encryption added delay. The turbine engine on the Abrams was louder than the Sherman's radial engine. Infantry crouching behind a tank in a firefight couldn't communicate with the crew inside. They were back to banging on the hull with rifle butts, back to standing in the open trying to get the commander's attention, back to coordination failures getting people killed. In 2006, the Army issued the Tusk upgrade, the Tank Urban Survival Kit. One of its primary components was an infantry telephone mounted on the rear hull of the M1A2 Abrams. Same location Miller had chosen, same basic design. A handset in a weatherproof box connected by wire to the tank's internal communication system. 62 years after a Signal Corps captain in Normandy built the first prototype, the United States Army came full circle and admitted that his solution was still the right solution. But the real lesson of Miller's telephone isn't about the technology. It's about who created it and why the system almost killed it. Here's what matters. Edward Miller wasn't a general. He wasn't a Pentagon innovator with a staff and a budget. He was a captain with a problem, a supply tent full of standard equipment, and 8 hours to find a solution. The telephone he built used technology from 1938 installed on tanks, using techniques any mechanic with a welding torch could replicate. There was nothing sophisticated about it. Nothing that required advanced engineering or classified research. It was obvious in retrospect. Which raises the question, why didn't anyone else think of it? The answer is that dozens of people probably thought of it. The difference was that Miller had the authority and the desperation to actually build it. He had a battalion commander who told him to fix the problem overnight instead of submitting a proposal up the chain. He had access to equipment and a tank he could modify without asking permission. And most critically, he worked in an army that, for all its bureaucracy, had a culture that tolerated field improvisation when official solutions failed. The German army had field telephones. They had tanks. They had the same coordination problems the Americans had. But they never installed phones on their tanks because the concept violated their command structure. A German panzer commandant received orders from officers, not from riflemen. The idea that a Gefreiter would pick up a phone and direct tank fire was institutionally impossible. Their system couldn't produce that innovation, even though the technology existed. The American system almost killed the telephone, too. Remember Colonel Gerhardt nearly shutting the program down because it bypassed procurement procedures. Remember General Penske trying to suspend all installations after one minor electrical fire. The bureaucracy wanted control, wanted standardization, wanted every modification to flow through proper channels and take proper time. Miller's telephone succeeded not because the system encouraged innovation, but because a few officers at critical moments chose to ignore the system and let results speak. That tension between institutional control and frontline improvisation defines military innovation. The armies that win wars are the ones that can balance both. They need structure to coordinate millions of men and billions of dollars of equipment. But they also need to let captains drill holes in tanks and sergeants weld scrap metal into hedgerow cutters when the standard solutions aren't working. The telephone spread because enough officers recognized that a good idea from the bottom was worth more than a perfect idea from the top that arrived 6 months too late. And there's one more detail about Miller's story. One final piece that brings everything full circle. In 2008, a man named Robert Miller, Edward Miller's son-in-law, posted a story on a military history website dedicated to the M4 Sherman tank. He'd been going through his father-in-law's papers after Edward died in 2004 at age 91. He found a folder containing the original technical drawings for the infantry telephone installation hand-sketched on graph paper in July 1944. He found a photograph of the prototype telephone box mounted on a Sherman from Charlie Company, 743rd Tank Battalion. And he found a letter from Colonel Duncan, written in 1953, thanking Miller for his service and specifically mentioning that the telephone modification had become standard equipment across the entire U.S. Armored Force. Robert Miller posted those documents online because he thought other history enthusiasts might find them interesting. The post got a few dozen comments. Most people had no idea that the infantry phone had been a field improvisation. They assumed it had been designed by Army Ordnance and issued with the tanks. The idea that one captain built the first one overnight in Normandy surprised them. That's how thoroughly Miller's invention had been absorbed into the standard equipment list. It had become so obviously correct that people forgot it hadn't always existed. That website post is why we know Edward Miller's name today. Without it, his contribution would have remained anonymous, credited generically to American ingenuity or field modifications in the history books. His family would have known. A few veterans from the 743rd would have remembered, but the broader historical record would have lost him. That's how close we came to this story disappearing completely. Miller never sought recognition. His family says he considered the telephone a minor contribution, something any Signal Corps officer with the right background would have figured out. He never understood why people made such a fuss about it when they learned the story. To him, it was obvious. The infantry needed to talk to the tanks. Radios didn't work. Telephones did. End of problem. The fact that this obvious solution changed armored warfare doctrine for 4 decades didn't impress him. He'd done his job. That was enough. From a Signal Corps captain with a toolbox and a deadline to a modification that saved thousands of lives across 3 wars and 60 years. Edward Miller proved that the most important innovations don't come from labs or committees. They come from people close enough to the problem to see it clearly and brave enough to solve it with whatever's lying around. No permission, no budget, just urgency and competence and a willingness to drill a hole in a tank when the rulebook says you're not supposed to. 40,000 American tanks, 62 years of continuous use. Thousands of lives saved because infantry could finally tell armor where to shoot. All because one exhausted officer in Normandy stayed up one night wiring a telephone into an ammunition box. That's the power of trusting the person closest to the problem. That's what happens when you let the man in the ditch talk to the man in the turret. That's what wars are won with. Not just steel and firepower, but a simple wire connecting human voice to human ear, closing the gap between the soldier who sees and the weapon that kills. Simple, obvious, revolutionary.